Hello, everyone. And again, thank you for your patience. I'm sorry that things got kind of screwed up last week. I don't know why we got locked out, but we're finally back into the textbook. And so needed that obviously to be able to complete each of these recordings. So we've got two for this week. And we're now looking at, it's been a few weeks since we've been talking about things, but now we're looking at uh, getting started with designing a course. And so we talked previously about some of these things, identifying important situational factors and important learning goals. Now we're going to be moving on to a next component here, and that is formulating appropriate feedback and assessment procedures. Okay, in this third component, you're, as a teacher, must be designing um, the course, and you're looking for how you're going to be formulating appropriate feedback and assessment procedures. For many, this has meant little more than giving traditional 2 midterms and a final. And I must admit that is not an uncommon thing that I do. I've got a pathophysiology class that I'm teaching for the entry-level DPT program at this time, and they are basically getting 3 exams. Now, for pathophysiology class, that may be appropriate, but for other classes, especially classes where there are clinical skills involved, that's probably not important, or probably not the best way of doing things. Traditionally, feedback and assessment involve the one task that many teachers find the most distasteful in teaching, and that is grading. And I find that not distasteful, but it's something that I wish I didn't have to do. I wish it could be just like saying, yes, you're clinically competent to perform things, or you're not clinically competent to perform things. But I don't know, it's almost like we have to have a level of pressure that's necessary because we need people to be studying, to be working hard, because ultimately they're going to have to take a national examination, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast. Now, let's look at auditive versus educative assessment. In 1998, Grant Wiggins generated a concept that is interesting here. He distinguishes between auditive and educative assessment. And in this figure, that illustrates the two concepts. Teachers whose only feedback and assessment procedures are, for example, 2 midterms and a final, this exemplifies the perspective of auditive assessment. When this is the only feedback and assessment that occurs within a course, it serves only one function: to audit student learning as a basis for the grade turned in. And oftentimes, it's auditing how much they can cram in a few days beforehand, and I wonder how much they retain in that. Now, again, some classes are really important for developing clinical skills, and there are things that I know that I teach in my pathophysiology class that I have to review year after year because it is getting exposed to people. Sometimes you don't get exposed to people with these certain conditions. And so that's where I think the value of learning really comes into play, is when you're out there practicing. However, we've got to present the material because they're going to be potentially tested on it on a national exam. So the auditive approach audits student learning for determining a grade. This approach to feedback and assessment is typically based on backward-looking assessment, with exams that look back on what was covered during the prior period of time and then determining whether or not students got it or not. The other is the educative assessment, and the purpose of it is to help students learn better. As long as we require grades, obviously we as teachers need valid and fair basis for the grades we give students. The problem is that most teachers do not know how to go beyond grading to be able to provide the kind of feedback and assessment that will enhance the learning process itself. So, looking at figure 3.5, educative assessment here has 4 primary components: forward-looking assessment, criteria and standards, self-assessment, and fidelity. The fidelity feedback is an addition by the textbook author. The acronym means that if we want our feedback to be educative rather than just tell students what grade they got, the feedback needs to be frequent, the F, immediate, the I, discriminating, the D, based on clear criteria and standards, and delivered lovingly, the L. If teachers can learn how to develop procedures for each of these 4 components, they will give themselves and their students a much clearer understanding of the degree to which the students are learning something effectively. That, in turn, will enable students to start the process of monitoring and evaluating their own learning. Now, to make this concept of educative assessment operational, let's take a look at figure 3.6. The first step in educative assessment is to identify what the assessment task is that you will ask students to perform. When a teacher creates any of the various assessment procedures that are typically used in a semester-long course, such as assignments and tests and things like that, one perspective that can be very helpful is to strive for forward-looking assessment rather than backward-looking assessment. Teachers using backward-looking assessment look back on what's been covered in the prior period of time. In forward-looking assessment, teachers look ahead to what they expect or want students to be able to do in the future as a result of having learned X, Y, and Z. The relevant question then becomes, imagine yourself in a situation when people are actually using this knowledge. Can you use the knowledge of X, Y, and Z to do this? To create forward-looking or authentic assessment, Wiggins, who created this approach, recommends that teachers create questions, problems, tests, and assignments that are realistic. The tasks replicate the ways in which a person's knowledge and abilities are tested in real-world situations. Require judgment and innovation. The student has to use knowledge and skills wisely and effectively to solve unstructured problems, such as when a plan must be designed and the solution involves more than following a set routine or procedure or plugging in knowledge. Ask the student to do the subject. Instead of reciting, restating, or replicating course content and prior knowledge through demonstration, the student has to carry out exploration and work within the discipline of science, history, or any other subject. Replicate or stimulate the context in which adults are tested in the workplace, in civic life, and in personal life. Context involves specific situations that have particular constraints, purposes, and audiences. Students need to experience what it's like to do tasks in workplace and other real-life contexts, which tend to be messy and murky. In other words, genuine tasks require good judgment. Authentic tasks undo the ultimately harmful secrecy, silence, and absence of resources and feedback that mark excessive school testing. Assess the student's ability to use a repertoire of knowledge and skill efficiently and effectively to negotiate a complex task. Most conventional test items are isolated elements of performance, similar to sideline drills in athletics rather than to the integrated use of skills that games require. Good judgment is required here too, although there is of course a place for drill tests. Performance is always more than a sum of the drills. Allow appropriate opportunities for students to rehearse, practice, consult resources, and get feedback on and refine performances and products. Although there is a role for the conventional secure test that keeps questions secret and keeps resource materials from students during the test, that testing must coexist with educative assessment if students are to improve performance. Now, let's look at changing backward-looking assessment to forward-looking assessment. Some examples may help teachers understand how to transform backward-looking assessment activities into forward-looking assessment. So Fink gives an example from one of his courses on world geography. Students studied a different world region each week and periodically had an exam on either one region or several regions. After studying a given region, an easy backward-looking option for assessment was to give students one of the following two assignments. List 3 distinctive characteristics of each country in this region, or in a multiple choice format, which of the following features most accurately characterizes country X in this region? This is a content-centered approach to assessment. Present some content and then ask, in essence, do you understand it and can you remember it? So now listed here is a forward-looking option. Imagine that you are working for an international company that wants to establish a commercial presence in the region. The company sells a product that requires a modest per capita income for people to purchase it. The corporate executives understand that they will not realize significant income during the first 5 years or so, but they want to establish a foothold in the region with hopes of financial success in the not too distant future. The key to success is being in a country that will have enough political stability to allow economic growth and sufficient other factors to support at least moderately high earning power among the general population. The company has asked you to serve on an advisory board that will recommend the country in which the company should open a new branch operation. Given what you've learned about the countries in the region, what country would you recommend as best meeting the needs of the company? So that's an interesting way to have the students think about what they've been learning in their world geography class, integrating things such as economic factors and political stability, and then making a judgment call based upon the knowledge that you have been able to collect. What would be an example within physical therapy or within occupational therapy? That's going to be your forum for this week. What would be an example of a forward-looking assessment? We see an example here. I'm really curious about what your ideas are going to be like. Now let's talk about exercising versus forward-looking assessment. So when trying to formulate forward-looking assessment, it's important to understand the difference between this and what can be described as exercising. When we introduce a particular protocol for working on a specific kind of problem, we then often give students homework problems in which they perform this protocol several times with slightly different parameters to the problem. So this kind of exercise characterizes many end-of-chapter problems. Exercising is good in that it provides practice and familiarity with how a particular mental activity works and hence is valuable in the early stages of learning. But exercising is not the same thing as forward-looking assessment. Eventually, students will find more intellectual excitement and motivation if they're challenged to use their new knowledge on realistic tasks that they can relate to more effectively. An important key to developing forward-looking assessment is for you as the teacher to think, what am I trying to prepare the students to do? What is it I'm trying to determine that the students are ready or not ready to do? Second step, identify appropriate criteria and standards. In general, we do not just want students to learn to do something, we want them to do it well. And that means they need to understand what well means. All assessment is an attempt to measure the quality of something and therefore by definition requires an appropriate criteria and standards which together are known as a rubric. For these reasons, it is extremely important to have clear and appropriate criteria and standards for use in both forward-looking assessment and in self-assessment. To construct a rubric for an individual assignment, a teacher should do the following. Choose an assignment that tests what you want to evaluate and make sure you are clear about your objectives for the assignment. Identify the criteria or traits that will count in the evaluation. These are nouns or noun phrases, for example, thesis, eye contact with the client, or use of color. For each trait, construct 2 to 5 point scale by creating descriptive statements of good and poor versions of this trait. And try out the scale with a sample of students or with colleagues and revise it as necessary. To give the concept of rubrics more concrete meaning, the authors offered multiple examples, two of which are shared here. One is concerned with criteria one might find in science, and the other in the humanities. An example for science, criteria of desired trait, experimental design for assignment on designing scientific experiments. Standards, 5, and you can look at these if you'd like to hear what each one means or the value there. I don't think I need to read through them, but each one has a criteria or a value associated with it, what they're looking for to earn that particular score. And here's an example from a humanities-based course. To provide an example of how criteria and standards can be developed in relation to major course goals, Fink describes an example of a professor that he worked with in a physics lab course. Together, they spent time identifying the main learning goals for the course and eventually formulated the following statement that focused on the application of learning. By the end of the course, students should be able to design, construct, and assess electronic apparatus to measure physical properties. Once these three key areas of student performance have been identified, he was then able to proceed to construct the important criteria related to each goal as illustrated here in this exhibit. So understanding what the goals are then allows one to create those classroom objectives. Next, for each criteria, the teacher developed a set of 4-point standards. These describe different levels of quality performance for each criterion. The high, which are the plus plus, and the low, which are the minus minus, ends of the standards for the three criteria are shown in Exhibit 3.7. So this is a strategy you could potentially use. Do I see people using this? No, not really. Could it enhance your coursework? Potentially. Would it be something that the accreditation bodies would love? Well, most definitely. I think the more detailed you are in your paperwork, whether you're looking at a university's regional accreditation or if you're looking at a national accreditation for your program, the more detailed you are, that information is evidence as to the thought that goes into preparing the course. But as I said, I'm not sure that people do this on a consistent basis unless they're people that are outside, or excuse me, people inside of the education world as it is. Third step, provide multiple opportunities for self-assessment in addition to developing forward-looking assessment procedures and clarifying criteria and standards. A third change toward creating educative assessments to create multiple opportunities for students to engage in self-assessment in or of their performance. Identify relevant criteria. First, students need to acquire or develop an initial understanding of what the relevant criteria and standards for assessing a particular kind of activity are. What distinguishes high quality from mediocre work in this area? Most of the time, students do not begin courses knowing the answer to this question, nor is it generally self-evident to a novice learner. One option is for the teacher to simply tell the students what the relevant criteria and standards are. But a better option when it is possible is to give students an opportunity to develop these criteria and standards themselves. This process can be initiated by having students brainstorm a list of criteria that they think might be relevant and appropriate. Then they can refine this list and develop their ability to use the criteria, first by assessing the work of other students and then by working on their own. Number 2, practice using the criteria on other students' work. After students acquire or develop a preliminary list of relevant criteria, the next step in developing their ability to apply these criteria is to practice using them in a process of giving feedback to other students on their work. Some teachers have students read copies of other students' draft papers and give feedback. To do this, students have to have some sense of what constitutes a good paper and then apply those criteria to the new papers. Next, practice using the criteria on one's own work. A third phase in this process occurs when students are able to apply performance criteria to their own work and make improvements based on that assessment. For this to happen, students need to perform a challenging task and then use relevant criteria to assess their own work. When students can do this effectively, they have succeeded in learning how to engage in honest self-assessment. Okay, next section here, 3 assessments of self-assessment activities, or 3 examples, of self-assessment activities. One interesting example of students giving feedback to each other occurs with sticky notes. So using this like in a business course, several student teams are asked to be consultants for a rapidly growing daycare center that's outgrown its paper-based record-keeping system. It needs a new computer-based system for keeping records for children, for attendance payments, and so on. So using sticky notes, at the end of each kind of session, team puts a blue sticky note by what they think is the best approach or answer to a problem. A yellow sticky note is one which they have a significant question about. They also write out the nature of their concern regarding the yellow note. A second one, so students asked to write a substantial end of semester paper that incorporates much of the subject for the semester, a standard sort of assignment. When the assignment's made, students are also given the criteria by which the papers will be evaluated, which is less common but not unheard of. But then the teacher tells the students to use the criteria to assess their own papers. When the students turn in the papers, they also indicate what grade they think their own paper deserves and why. Teacher still reads the papers and does her own preliminary evaluation. If the student's self-declared grade is within one level of the grade the teacher would give on a plus-minus scale, the student's grade is the one that goes in the grade book. If the difference is more than one level, the student must come in for an appointment and talk with the teacher about why the self-declared grade was as high or as low as it was. At this time, the teacher shares her view on the paper. The student then goes home, reassesses the paper, and turns in a new grade and justification. So that's kind of an interesting one. I've used kind of something similar to that where I've had people do kind of a video recording of them utilizing motivational interviewing techniques, and then I haven't asked them to grade it, but I've asked them to kind of self-reflect and to highlight what they might do better the next time. Third example is dealing with a final project in a particular course. He had students, this particular teacher, write a statement assessing how well they've learned to engage in critical thinking by the end of the course. He notes the pressure this creates for doing an honest self-assessment. A well thought out paper in which the student argues, I only did a mediocre job of learning to think critically, will receive a high grade and therefore will probably raise the student's course grade. However, a paper that tries to argue, I did a great job of learning to think critically, but is unable to provide persuasive evidence for that point, will receive a low grade and therefore will probably lower the student's course grade. So some interesting approaches there. Fourth step, providing the fidelity feedback. So remember, this is the frequent, immediate, discriminating, and done lovingly approach. Frequent feedback occurs in every class, if possible, according to the textbook author. Immediate feedback occurs very close in time to the learning activity itself. Discriminating feedback distinguishes between good and poor performance in a way that's clear for students. And lovingly delivered feedback is essential to get the message through. Now, some classes, I don't know that doing this will be that easy to do, but in other classes where you've got labs and a lot of our clinical-based courses, there could be that opportunity for providing frequent, immediate, discriminating, and done lovingly type of feedback. One key idea in educative assessment is that the process has multiple goals. In addition to needing procedures that give the students and the teacher valid information about student performance, courses need procedures that support the student's ability and desire to continue learning. This means teachers need to attend to the psychological effects of different ways of providing feedback and assessment. So, the need for a scoreboard and for applause. What's this mean? As a sports fan and an occasional coach, the author writes that there is impressive motivation that sporting activities generate in people, despite the painful and universal experience that even the best teams have when they lose. What accounts for players' continuing motivation to get better? After looking at this phenomenon and at teaching and learning situations, Finks come up with the belief that situations with a scoreboard and applause have the elements necessary to powerfully stimulate high performance, whether that be in sports or in education settings. In sports, players have a scoreboard that gives them quick, reliable feedback on the quality of their performance. In education, this is the function of feedback based on clear criteria, frequently and fairly applied. Whether students are learning how to think critically or how to interpret a novel, they need prompt feedback and clear criteria for knowing whether they did it well or not. Next area here, looking at examples of successful scoreboards and applause. One example of successful use of a scoreboard and applause is a music education professor who prepares students to be band directors. He described what he considers to be a key observation in teaching. He set up the following learning sequence that's repeated several times during the course. Each student transcribes a piece of music. That student then has to teach the new piece of music to an ad hoc band composed of fellow students in a series of 10-minute periods once a week. Each teaching session is videotaped. Immediately following the teaching episode, the student teacher receives verbal and written feedback from peers, TAs, and the college teacher. Following the videotape, the student teacher also writes a self-analysis of the session in a journal, personal feelings that occurred while teaching, and after watching the videotape, how well the class seemed to respond or perform, and so on. Before the next teaching session, the student teacher meets with the college professor for a coaching session using the videotape and the student's self-analysis and trying new ways of leading the rehearsal and other possible behaviors. That's interesting. That sounds very time consuming. I've got in my inbox about 40 videos that I still need to grade. It's been a very busy time period, and these are only 5-minute videos. Students have provided their feedback to it, but I've been delayed in responding. Some of our class sizes within DPT and OTD programs can be extremely large, so that seems like that would be the type of thing where you need to make sure you carve out plenty of time. Do you have that time? Interesting thought. Next up, the importance of empathy and feedback. Wiggins identifies 2 key elements as being fundamental in generating assessment that's truly educative. The first is authentic tasks, or what is labeled as forward-looking assessment. Second is providing performer-friendly feedback. All right, so this ends the 3rd chapter within the book. Kind of summarizing, the recommendations are to create forward-looking assessment, questions, and problems, develop clear and appropriate criteria and standards for evaluating student performance, create opportunities for students to engage in self-assessment, and provide fidelity feedback, feedback that is frequent, immediate, discriminating, and done lovingly. Here again is that interrelationship of the four basic components of educative assessment. And to conclude the chapter, Fink introduced a new model in this chapter of the course design process, integrative course design, and started the task of showing how it can help teachers design more powerful learning experiences for students. This began with the first step of analyzing the situational factors in the teaching situation, which must be done thoroughly and carefully because the results of this analysis will affect the three key decisions that have to be made. The second step focuses on the question of what the teacher wants students to get out of the course, that is, the learning goals for the course. Fink recommends that this task be done in a way that is learning-centered rather than content-centered, and that the taxonomy of significant learning be used to formulate a powerful set of learning goals. The third step is to formulate good feedback and assessment procedures. Fink recommends here to use a set of procedures known collectively as educative assessment. These procedures are capable of supporting and furthering the learning process itself while still providing the teacher and the learner with information about how well the student is learning. That ends this chapter.